It was a warm September afternoon in the quiet suburbs of Nashville, Tennessee. The kind of day that seemed to be made for new beginnings. The streets were bathed in golden sunlight as the sound of traffic hummed in the distance. A month-long celebration had just ended for Sarah Donovan, a 28-year-old newlywed. She had married Thomas Miller, her college sweetheart, in an intimate ceremony at a local vineyard. To all who attended, Sarah and Thomas seemed like the perfect couple. They were well matched, both smart and ambitious, and the future appeared bright. But Sarah's heart still carried a secret from her past, one she couldn't shake. A day after her wedding, Sarah decided to make one last visit to someone she hadn't seen in years. Jason Edwards, her ex-boyfriend. Jason had been the love of her life before Thomas. They had shared a deep connection, but life's twists and turns had eventually separated them. Though Sarah had moved on, a small part of her still clung to the past, wondering what if. On the morning after her wedding, she made the decision to pay Jason a visit. It was meant to be a simple farewell, a chance to say goodbye properly. No lingering feelings, no regrets, just closure. She told Thomas she was going out for a walk, and when he asked where, she simply said, "Just clearing my mind, love. I'll be back soon." Jason's apartment was just a short drive away, tucked in a quiet part of town. Sarah pulled up to the building, her heart fluttering with a mix of excitement and guilt. She had left things unsaid with Jason, and now after her wedding, she hoped this meeting would finally put everything to rest. She told herself it would be just a friendly conversation, a way to tie up loose ends. When she arrived at Jason's door, he greeted her with a smile that felt too familiar, too comforting. The warmth in his eyes was hard to ignore, and for a moment, Sarah felt the past rushing back in. They sat down in his small but cozy living room, talking about old times and catching up on everything that had happened in the years since they parted ways. The conversation was light at first, but as the minutes passed, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Jason was holding something back. "I'm happy for you, Sarah," Jason said, his voice a little too calm. "You deserve happiness. I've always known you'd find someone great." Thomas is a lucky guy, but Sarah could sense the tension in his words. There was an undercurrent of something deeper. The old spark between them was still there, buried beneath years of silence and unanswered questions. "You don't sound happy for me," Sarah replied gently, her eyes meeting his. "I think you still care, Jason. I think you always have." Jason looked away, his jaw tightening. "It's not that," he said. "It's just, I wasn't expecting to see you again, especially not like this. After everything we shared." Sarah sighed, feeling the weight of his words. "I never meant to hurt you, Jason, but we both moved on, right?" Jason didn't answer immediately. He stood up and walked over to the window, staring outside. "I don't know if I ever really moved on," he said quietly. Suddenly, there was a shift in the atmosphere. It was no longer a casual meeting. Something darker had entered the room. Sarah's instincts screamed at her that something was wrong, but she couldn't quite pinpoint it. Jason turned back to her, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked in a way that made Sarah's heart race. He was too quiet now, too still. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I really am," he said, his voice low, almost whispering. "But I can't let you go like this." Before Sarah could react, Jason moved quickly. The next thing she knew, she felt a sharp pain in her chest as the cold steel of a knife pressed against her skin. Her breath hitched in shock, and for a moment, she couldn't believe what was happening. Jason's face twisted with emotion, anger, hurt, jealousy, all mixing into a frenzy that she had never seen before. "You chose him," Jason spat, his voice trembling. "You left me for him. I loved you, Sarah. I never stopped loving you." Sarah struggled, her hands reaching out to push him away, but it was too late. In a split second, Jason plunged the knife deeper, and Sarah let out a gasp, her body going limp as the world around her blurred. The last thing she saw before the darkness took over was Jason's face, distorted by regret and rage. Later that afternoon, when Thomas had come to realize Sarah hadn't returned, his concern turned into panic. He tried calling her, but there was no answer. He had no idea where she could be, and the thought of Sarah being in danger made his heart race. He called her best friend Jane, but she hadn't heard from her either. The hours stretched on, and with each passing minute, his anxiety deepened. Then, just as the sun was setting, Thomas received a call from the police. They had found Sarah. She was lying motionless in Jason's apartment, her life snuffed out by a man who couldn't accept that the past was over. It was a devastating blow, one that would send shockwaves through Thomas and Sarah's friends and family. No one had expected this kind of ending. Not on Sarah's wedding day, not when everything seemed so perfect. The next morning, Detective Olivia Harris stood at the scene, examining the crime scene carefully. She had been with the Nashville PD for over a decade. In cases like these, crimes of passion were nothing new to her. But this one felt different. There was something more insidious about it. It wasn't just jealousy, it was obsession. The way Jason had killed Sarah, the brutal violence, everything pointed to a man who had been pushed to the edge by a past love that he couldn't let go of. As Olivia looked around the room, she could see the small details that didn't add up. The way Sarah had been positioned, the lack of a struggle, it was almost as if Jason had planned this. And the guilt on his face when he was arrested. It wasn't the face of a man who had acted in a moment of blind rage. It was the face of someone who knew exactly what they had done. Olivia scribbled a note in her notepad, already piecing together the story in her mind. She had a feeling this would be one of the more challenging cases of her career, but she was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The investigation had just begun, and Olivia knew one thing for sure. Jason Edwards would pay for what he had done. Detective Olivia Harris stood in the small living room of Jason Edwards' apartment, staring down at the crime scene. Sarah Donovan's body had been carefully removed by the medical examiner's team, but Olivia couldn't shake the haunting image of the young woman's lifeless form. Her eyes lingered on the small pool of blood that had stained the hardwood floor, the chilling reminder of a violent act committed just hours ago. The scene itself was eerily quiet now. Jason's apartment, usually modest and neat, felt off. There was a certain heaviness in the air, a lingering tension. Olivia had been a detective long enough to trust her instincts, and right now her gut was telling her that there was more to this story than what met the eye. She took a deep breath and surveyed the room. Nothing seemed out of place, no signs of a break-in, and there didn't appear to be any forced entry. The windows were shut, and the door had been locked when the officers arrived. It was clear this was no random act of violence. Sarah had come here willingly. But why? And why had Jason, of all people, resorted to murder? Detective Harris, a voice broke through her thoughts. Officer Daniels, one of the first responders on the scene, was standing in the doorway holding a small evidence bag. He was a young cop, fresh out of the academy, but he had already proven to be sharp when it came to details. Olivia turned to face him. "What do you have for me, Daniels?" He handed her the bag, inside of which was a bloodied knife. "Found it in the kitchen trash bin," he said, his voice tinged with unease. "It matches the wound pattern on the victim." Olivia examined the knife closely. The blade was long and sharp, with a handle that looked like it had been gripped tightly, judging by the imprints of fingerprints on it. The blood on the blade was still fresh, indicating it had been used recently, likely only hours before the police arrived. This knife had been the weapon that had ended Sarah's life, but there was something that bothered her about it. The knife wasn't hidden away. It was carelessly tossed into the trash, as if whoever had disposed of it wasn't concerned about leaving behind evidence. "Anything else?" Olivia asked, her tone steady, masking the brewing storm of questions in her mind. Daniels hesitated. "Yes, ma'am. There's a phone on the table, belonging to the victim. It was unlocked when we found it. We checked the recent calls and messages. There's something strange here." Olivia raised an eyebrow, intrigued. She nodded for Daniels to continue. "The last message Sarah received was from someone named Thomas. It was sent just an hour before we arrived. There's no sign of any argument, but, well, it looks like she was expected home. It's as if she was trying to make things right, telling him she would be back soon." Olivia's mind raced. Thomas Miller, Sarah's husband. He had to be involved in some way, right? But how? Was he somehow part of this? The message from him seemed to suggest she had planned on returning to her new life. So why would she stop by Jason's apartment? "Let's take a look at that phone," Olivia said, her voice firm. "We'll need to search through the rest of her texts and calls. It might give us a better sense of where she was emotionally before this happened. As Daniels handed her the phone, Olivia continued to process the facts. Jason Edwards had been Sarah's ex-boyfriend, but their breakup had been years ago. They both had moved on. At least that's what everyone believed. But the way Jason had acted, the coldness of his murder, suggested something deeper was at play. This wasn't a random act of passion. This was something more calculated, a dark obsession that had festered for years. Olivia had seen this before. People driven by jealousy, by an inability to let go of the past. And Jason? He wasn't the first man she had encountered who struggled with that. But there was something different about him, something that stood out. He had the look of a man who was haunted, not just by Sarah, but by the unresolved anger and frustration of being left behind. The phone buzzed in her hand, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a notification from the local PD. They had just finished canvassing the area around Jason's building. One of the neighbors had remembered hearing something strange earlier in the afternoon. Loud arguing, followed by a scream. "Perfect," Olivia muttered under her breath. She turned to Daniels. "Get me a list of everyone who lives in the building. I want to talk to that neighbor and get a statement. See if anyone else heard or saw anything unusual." Daniels nodded and headed for the door. Olivia glanced back at the room, her mind running through 1,000 questions. She needed more information on Jason. Who was he really? What had happened between him and Sarah all those years ago? And why hadn't she mentioned him to Thomas before the wedding? As the investigation moved forward, Olivia knew she couldn't rely on just what was in front of her. There was more to uncover, and she needed to find it. If Jason Edwards was hiding something, she would find it. And if he had killed Sarah out of jealousy, she would ensure he paid for it. Later that evening, Olivia sat at her desk in the precinct, reviewing the preliminary reports. The coroner had confirmed that Sarah had been killed between 2 and 4 p.m. that afternoon. The time frame lined up with the message from Thomas, indicating that Sarah had left the wedding celebration and visited Jason shortly after. Olivia's phone buzzed. It was a message from one of the officers assigned to interview Jason's co-workers. "We've got something," the message read. "Jason's co-workers say he's been acting strange lately. He's been distant, almost obsessed with Sarah. They even mentioned that he showed up to work late the day before the wedding, and his mood was off. We're going to dig deeper." Olivia frowned. This was the break she had been hoping for. Jason's co-workers might know more about his state of mind than anyone else. He had been hiding something, and it was time to expose the truth. As the evening wore on, Olivia felt the weight of the case settling over her. The deeper she dug into Jason's life, the more she realized that this wasn't just a murder. It was the tragic culmination of years of unresolved pain and unspoken emotions. Tomorrow she would confront Jason, and she would get the answers she needed. But for now, all she could do was wait. The next morning, Detective Olivia Harris sat in her car, the steady hum of the engine and the low buzz of her thoughts keeping her company as she prepared to confront Jason Edwards. She had gone over the case files again and again, but each time the question lingered in her mind. What had driven Jason to kill Sarah? Jason Edwards had always been a man of few words. Olivia had gathered from his co-workers that he was private, distant, someone who kept to himself. But there had been rumors, whispered conversations about a past relationship with Sarah that hadn't ended well. Olivia's instincts told her that it was more than just jealousy. There was something deeper, something unresolved that had been festering for years. Jason had been waiting for her at the precinct. His body language was stiff, guarded. When Olivia walked into the interrogation room, Jason didn't look up at first. His eyes were focused on his hands, which were clasped tightly in his lap. He seemed small, unassuming, but Olivia knew better. The most dangerous people often hid behind a quiet exterior. "Jason Edwards," Olivia began, her voice steady but commanding. "I'm Detective Harris. I need you to tell me everything you know about Sarah Donovan's death." Jason's head snapped up, his eyes wide with an unreadable expression. He looked genuinely surprised, but then his face tightened, his jaw set in a hard line. He was hiding something. Olivia could feel it. "I didn't kill her," Jason said in a low voice, his words flat, almost robotic. "I swear I didn't." Olivia took a seat across from him, folding her hands. On the table, she watched him carefully, studying his every movement. There was something off about his reaction. Most people in his position would be devastated, emotional. But Jason, he seemed too calm, too collected. Then why was she at your apartment? Olivia asked, her tone soft but insistent. Jason shifted in his seat, looking uncomfortable. She came to say goodbye. Goodbye? Olivia raised an eyebrow. She was married, Jason. Newly married. Why would she come to say goodbye to you just hours after her wedding? He flinched at the mention of the wedding, but quickly recovered, his eyes narrowing. I don't know. She said it was over between us, that she'd moved on, but I guess I didn't believe her. I thought she still had feelings for me. Olivia leaned forward slightly, keeping her tone neutral. So, you're telling me that Sarah came to your apartment to say goodbye, and then you just let her leave? No argument, no confrontation. Jason's face reddened. He ran a hand through his hair, suddenly looking agitated. I didn't kill her, detective. You have to believe me. It wasn't like that. Olivia let his words hang in the air for a moment before speaking again. We found a bloodied knife in your trash, Jason. A knife that matches the wounds found on Sarah's body. We've also interviewed your coworkers. They told us you've been acting strange lately. Obsessed with Sarah. Can you explain that? For the first time, Jason looked shaken. His hands trembled slightly and he pulled them back into his lap. His shoulders hunched. His eyes darted toward the door, as if searching for an escape. Olivia had him now. The crack in his composure was the opening she needed. I never wanted to hurt her, he whispered, his voice cracking. I swear I didn't mean for it to go this far. I couldn't take it anymore. Watching her marry someone else, knowing she'd never be mine. Olivia's heart raced. This was the moment she'd been waiting for. The truth was coming out, piece by piece. Jason, Olivia said softly, her voice steady. You need to tell me what happened. I can't help you if you don't give me the truth. Did you kill Sarah? Jason swallowed hard, his face pale. He looked away from Olivia's piercing gaze, as if searching for some kind of answer in the sterile walls of the room. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. I loved her, detective. I still loved her. She was my everything. And then she just walked away. She married him, and I couldn't accept it. I kept thinking she'd come back, that maybe she was just confused, that I was the one she really wanted. Jason's voice was becoming more frantic now, the desperation leaking into his words. He was unraveling, losing control, and Olivia could see the guilt in his eyes. The walls were closing in on him. I didn't mean to kill her, he continued, his eyes welling up. I just wanted to talk to her, to make her see that we still had something, that we could be together. But when she wouldn't listen, when she told me it was over, I snapped. I just snapped. Olivia's pulse quickened. What do you mean you snapped? I grabbed the knife, Jason said, his voice trembling. It was all a blur. I didn't plan it. I didn't want to hurt her, but I couldn't stop myself. She was leaving me, and I couldn't bear it. I just wanted to make her stay. Jason's confession hung in the air like a weight. Olivia sat back, processing his words. He had killed Sarah out of jealousy and anger, an outburst fueled by years of unresolved emotions. But it wasn't just the jealousy that had driven him. It was his obsessive need to control her, to keep her tethered to him even when she had moved on. And after that, Olivia asked, her voice hardening. What did you do? I panicked, Jason admitted, his voice barely audible. I didn't know what to do. I thought about calling the cops, but I was afraid. I was afraid of what they'd think, of what I'd done. So I tried to cover it up. I threw the knife in the trash. I cleaned up the blood. I thought I could get away with it. Olivia nodded slowly, her expression hard. You didn't get away with it, Jason. Not this time. Jason slumped in his chair, his head bowed in shame. I didn't want to kill her, he muttered again. I never wanted to kill her. Olivia stood up, her gaze locked on him. I'm going to have to arrest you for the murder of Sarah Donovan. You're going to be charged with first-degree murder. Jason didn't fight back. He didn't protest or make a move to escape. He simply nodded, as if he had resigned himself to the inevitable. The truth had come out, and there was no going back. As Olivia left the interrogation room, she felt the weight of the case settle heavily on her. Jason had confessed, but there was still so much more to process. Sarah's death had been the result of a tragic, misguided love, a love that had festered into something dangerous. And now her family and friends would have to face the painful reality that Sarah's life had been cut short by someone who had once been her lover. For Olivia, the case wasn't over yet. There were still questions to answer, and the story behind Sarah's life would continue to unfold. But one thing was certain: justice for Sarah Donovan was finally within reach. Detective Olivia Harris sat back at her desk, the morning light streaming through the blinds, casting long shadows across the room. Jason Edwards' confession had been enough to make a case, but there was still something about the way he had spoken that nagged at her. His words, though seemingly genuine, didn't completely sit right. It was almost as if there were pieces missing, something that didn't fit the narrative he had built. Olivia needed more. She had gathered enough physical evidence in Jason's admission of guilt, but there was a deeper layer to this case that she couldn't shake off. Why had Sarah been so insistent on visiting Jason the day after her wedding? Why had she chosen to say goodbye to him when she had just pledged her life to another man? Something didn't add up. Her thoughts were interrupted when Officer Ramirez knocked on her door, poking his head inside. "Detective Harris," he began, "I think you should take a look at this." Olivia followed him to the evidence room, where she was presented with Sarah Donovan's phone. The phone had been found in the car the victim had been driving, parked near her home on the night of the murder. The device had been locked, but Ramirez had managed to get into it after running the necessary permissions. What they discovered was troubling. "Take a look at these," Ramirez said, pointing to a series of text messages. Olivia's eyes scanned the messages, her brow furrowing as she read them. The first few texts were from Sarah's husband, Matt, confirming plans for their wedding night. The conversation was filled with loving words and excitement, but as she scrolled further, Olivia noticed a change in tone. The text became sparse, and then, unexpectedly, a string of messages from Jason Edwards began to appear. "Jason, I can't believe you're really going through with this. Are you sure it's what you want?" Sarah, "I'm happy, Jason. It's over between us." Jason, "I can't just let you go. I won't be able to live with myself knowing I'm not the one you're with." Sarah, "Jason, we've talked about this. It's over. I love Matt and I'm marrying him." Jason, "I'll never let you go. Not without a fight." Olivia felt a chill run down her spine. These texts painted a different picture than the one Jason had presented. The jealousy was evident, but there was something darker lurking in his words. This wasn't just a man who couldn't let go. This was someone who felt entitled to Sarah, someone who believed he could control her. But what really caught Olivia's attention was a final text from Sarah to Jason, sent just hours before her death. "Sarah, I'm coming over. I need to talk. Just for closure. Please don't make this harder than it already is." Olivia stood still, holding the phone tightly in her hands. It was clear now. Sarah hadn't just gone to Jason's apartment for a casual farewell. There was a sense of urgency in her message. She had been trying to end things with him, once and for all, but Jason hadn't been ready to let go. "Get the wedding photos," Olivia ordered, her mind racing. She had to see the look on Matt Donovan's face when he had seen Sarah just hours before her death. Something told her that the key to understanding Sarah's final moments lay in the dynamics of her relationships. Jason's jealousy wasn't just a reaction to her marriage, it was something deeper, a fixation that had crossed into obsession. As Olivia was leaving the evidence room, Officer Ramirez called her back. "Detective, we've got something else. We found security footage from a gas station near Jason's apartment. It shows Sarah's car arriving around midnight. But there's something odd." Ramirez handed her a tablet with the footage queued up. Sarah's car was visible, pulling into the parking lot. But what caught Olivia's attention wasn't the vehicle. It was Jason himself lurking in the shadows, walking toward the car after Sarah had parked. "I was hoping you could explain what happened next," Ramirez said. "We never saw Jason leave the scene, but we know he was there." Olivia stared at the screen, her thoughts swirling. The footage confirmed her suspicions. Jason had been watching Sarah from the moment she arrived. There was no accidental encounter here. This had been premeditated, planned, and executed with cold intent. But that wasn't all. Just before Sarah got back in her car and drove off, Jason was seen approaching the vehicle, talking to her through the window. From the footage, it appeared that Sarah had tried to drive away, but Jason stepped in front of the car, blocking her. After a brief exchange, Sarah seemed to make a quick gesture as if trying to leave. Jason reached into his pocket, likely for a weapon, and that's when the camera cut out. Olivia's mind raced. She had seen enough to know that Sarah was not just an innocent victim of a jealous ex. She had been trying to escape him, to leave him behind once and for all. Jason hadn't been content with just losing her. He had wanted to punish her for her happiness, for moving on. With the new footage and Sarah's final messages in hand, Olivia felt more certain than ever that Jason was the one responsible for her murder. But she still had a nagging feeling that there was more to uncover, something in Jason's past that might explain his uncontrollable rage. She needed to dig deeper into Jason Edwards' history. What had happened in their past? What had driven him to this level of obsession? It was time to go back to the beginning, to uncover the moments that had shaped Jason's warped sense of entitlement. The next step was clear. Olivia needed to speak to Jason's friends and family, anyone who could shed light on what had happened between him and Sarah. But the pieces were starting to come together, and for the first time, Olivia felt the weight of the case lighten just a little. Justice for Sarah Donovan was within reach. She could almost taste it. But the deeper she dug, the more she realized that this was just the tip of the iceberg. The twisted relationship between Sarah and Jason was more complicated than she could have ever imagined. And the truth, Olivia knew, was still far from fully uncovered. Chapter 5. The Past Unveiled. Detective Olivia Harris couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to Jason Edwards than the angry, jealous man he had portrayed in his confession. She had seen enough cases of domestic violence and obsession to know that things weren't always what they seemed. It was time to go back into Jason's past and uncover the roots of his dangerous obsession with Sarah Donovan. The first step was to speak with those who knew him best, his family and close friends. Olivia started with Jason's parents. His father, Robert Edwards, was a retired military man, and his mother, Linda Edwards, worked as a nurse. Both lived in a quiet, suburban neighborhood just outside of the city. Olivia hoped they could provide some insight into Jason's childhood, his relationship with Sarah, and any potential signs that might have hinted at the path he had ultimately taken. Olivia knocked on the door of the Edwards house one chilly morning, her breath visible in the cold air. When Linda Edwards answered, she seemed hesitant but invited Olivia in. Jason's mother was a woman of average build, her graying hair tied back in a neat bun, her face lined with the kind of weariness that came from years of nursing and raising a family. She looked at Olivia with a mix of curiosity and concern. "Detective Harris, what is this about? Is my son in trouble?" Linda's voice quivered, betraying the fear she tried to suppress. "I'm afraid so, Mrs. Edwards," Olivia said gently, taking a seat at the kitchen table. "I'm investigating the death of Sarah Donovan. Your son, Jason, is currently a person of interest." Linda's eyes widened and she placed a hand over her mouth. "But Jason loves Sarah. He was obsessed with her. Yes, but he never wanted to hurt her. He wanted to be with her." Olivia nodded. "That's what we've been told. But I need to understand more about their past, and more importantly, Jason's past. Was there anything that stood out about his behavior growing up?" Linda's face softened, her eyes distant as she recalled her son's childhood. "Jason was always different. He was a good boy, but there was always something about him that made me worry. He was very possessive, even as a child. When he was around 8, he would cry if another child played with his toys. He was always protective of what he considered his." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "As he got older, I noticed he became very focused on Sarah. They met in high school, you know. I think he was always in love with her, but she never felt the same way. She was too independent for him." "Did you ever speak to him about it?" Olivia asked. "I did many times," Linda admitted, "but he would always brush it off. He'd say, 'Mom, I'm just being protective. I care about her, that's all.'" I didn't realize how far it went. It wasn't until he started acting out after she married Matt that I knew something was wrong. Olivia's mind was racing. Jason had always been controlling, even as a child. His need for control over Sarah had been ingrained in him from a young age. But was that enough to explain his violent outbursts the night she died? Or had something else pushed him to the edge? Olivia thanked Linda for her time and left the Edwards home, feeling the weight of her words settle heavily on her shoulders. Jason's possessiveness was not just a fleeting trait. It had been a part of him for most of his life. But what had finally pushed him to murder? The next stop was Jason's closest friends. Olivia wanted to understand what his inner circle thought of him, especially in the weeks leading up to Sarah's death. She contacted a few of Jason's old friends from college, hoping they could shed light on his mental state during those final days. One of his friends, Daniel Thompson, had known Jason for over a decade. Daniel had been a groomsman at Jason's wedding, and from the look of things, they were still close. He met Olivia at a local coffee shop, his face full of concern. "Detective, I don't know what to say," Daniel began. "Jason's always been intense, you know. He'd talk about Sarah nonstop. Even after they broke up, he'd bring her up in conversation like they were still together. He could never let go of her. Did he ever mention how he felt about her marrying Matt?" Olivia pressed. "Yeah," Daniel replied. "He hated it. I could see it in his eyes whenever Matt's name came up. He'd joke about it at first, but deep down, I could tell he was seething. He would say things like, 'She's making a mistake. Matt doesn't deserve her.' But I never thought it would go this far." Daniel looked away, clearly uncomfortable. "But I'll tell you this, Detective. Jason was never the same after Sarah got engaged. He went off the deep end, trying everything to win her back. I tried to talk to him, tell him to move on, but it was like he was obsessed with the idea of being with her." Olivia listened intently, trying to piece together the timeline. Jason's obsession had taken root long before Sarah's wedding day. It wasn't just about losing her. It was about his inability to accept her decision to move on with her life. The more Olivia learned about Jason's fixation on Sarah, the more it became clear that he had crossed a line from infatuation to possession. But the most disturbing part of the conversation came when Daniel added, "The night she died, Jason came to me. He was in a frenzy, pacing around my apartment. He kept saying, 'She's gone, Daniel. She's really gone.' When I asked him what he meant, he just stared at me and said, 'I couldn't let her go. I just couldn't.'" Olivia felt a chill run down her spine. Jason had already confessed to the murder, but his words to Daniel were telling. He had been in a state of panic and disbelief. He had killed Sarah, yes, but there was something more at play. This wasn't just a crime of passion. It was the final act of a man who felt completely and utterly entitled to her. As Olivia left the coffee shop, she reflected on everything she had learned. Jason's past, his jealousy, and his inability to let go of Sarah had all played a part in her death. But there was still one final piece of the puzzle left to uncover. How had he planned the murder so meticulously? Why had he been able to hide his true intentions so well? There was more to this case than just a jealous lover's rage. Olivia was getting closer, but she knew the real truth was still just out of reach. Detective Olivia Harris spent the next few days reviewing the evidence, trying to connect the dots between Jason Edwards' obsession with Sarah and the cold-blooded murder that followed. There was something unsettling about how methodical Jason had been in his actions. It wasn't just the crime of a man who had lost control. It was the act of someone who had been planning this for a long time. The confession Jason had given the previous week had been straightforward, but there were inconsistencies. Olivia had noticed that Jason was unnervingly calm during his interrogation, almost as though he expected the entire situation to play out exactly the way it had. He had confessed to being at Sarah's house that evening, but the details of the murder were sparse. Jason had admitted to shooting her, but he had never explained why he chose that particular moment to end her life. Olivia decided to take another look at the crime scene photos. Sarah's house had been meticulously tidy, a reflection of her personality. The way her body had been positioned in the living room seemed too calculated for a random act of rage. The gunshots, she knew, were fatal, but they weren't all fired in a chaotic frenzy. They had been deliberate, each shot placed with care, with enough time in between them for Jason to be fully aware of what he was doing. The weapon used was a Glock 19, a semi-automatic handgun. It was Jason's, according to the paperwork from the police search of his home. But there was something strange about the placement of the gun. The gun had been discarded on the floor near Sarah's body, but when the police retrieved it, they found it was nearly out of ammunition. The shell casings had been carefully swept away, and the gun had been placed where it could easily be found, as if he wanted to make sure it looked like he had been caught in the act. That's when Olivia began to wonder, had Jason actually planned the murder, or had it been a spur-of-the-moment decision? The way the crime had been set up didn't seem to fit with Jason's confessed emotions of anger and jealousy. It seemed too staged, too precise for a man overcome with rage. Olivia turned her attention to the timeline of the evening. Jason had arrived at Sarah's house shortly after 8 p.m., a few hours after the wedding reception had ended. The wedding had been a lavish affair, and it wasn't unusual for Sarah to still be in her bridal gown. She had always been one to make an entrance, to create moments that felt like the culmination of her dream. But she had also been exhausted from the long day. Olivia had a feeling that Sarah had been vulnerable that night, and perhaps Jason had used her weakened emotional state to his advantage. The toxicology report from Sarah's autopsy revealed something unexpected. She had traces of alcohol and a small amount of prescription medication in her system. It was nothing alarming, but it was enough to make Olivia question the circumstances surrounding her final moments. Sarah's death had come quickly, and the trajectory of the bullets suggested that she hadn't seen it coming. Olivia needed more than just Jason's confession. She needed to understand the mindset of a man who had orchestrated the death of someone he had once loved. Olivia decided to go back to Sarah's best friend, Amber Matthews, to dig deeper into Sarah's mindset before the wedding. Amber had always been the one person who could talk to Sarah about her past relationships, especially her one with Jason. Olivia needed to understand what Sarah's emotions had been like, what she had said in the days leading up to her wedding, and whether she had confided in anyone about any lingering fears. Amber met Olivia at a quiet park in the city, a place where they could speak without interruption. She was visibly shaken, her face pale from lack of sleep. Amber had always been a bubbly and outgoing woman, but this tragedy had drained the life out of her. She looked at Olivia with a sense of desperation. "Detective, I just don't understand." Sarah was so happy. She was finally getting married to Matt, the love of her life. Why would Jason do this? What did she ever do to deserve this? Olivia sat down next to her, her voice gentle but firm. "I need you to think back, Amber. Was there ever a moment in the weeks leading up to the wedding when Sarah seemed worried? Did she ever mention Jason? Did she say anything that might indicate she was afraid?" Amber hesitated, her eyes flicking to the ground as if she was trying to remember something. Finally, she spoke in a low voice. "Sarah did mention something, but I didn't think it was serious at the time. A few days before the wedding, she said Jason had been sending her messages, and he showed up at her apartment uninvited. He was drunk," she said, "and she had to tell him to leave. But she didn't seem scared. She just thought he was being possessive, you know? But I didn't think he'd actually—" Amber's voice cracked, and she wiped away a tear. "Did she tell you what he said to her that night?" Olivia asked, trying to hold on to the thread of information. "She said," he told her, "you'll always be mine, Sarah. I won't let you go." And then he left. I remember she was shaken up after that. She said it felt like he was threatening her, but she didn't want to make a big deal out of it. She didn't want to let Matt know. I think she was trying to keep everything normal for the wedding, but deep down I could tell she was worried. Olivia processed the information. Jason's words, the possessiveness, the jealousy, it all pointed to something darker than a man simply losing his temper. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a calculated act driven by an obsessive need for control. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Jason hadn't just murdered Sarah out of jealousy. He had done it because he believed, in his twisted mind, that she was his to control. He had seen her moving on with Matt as a betrayal, and he had decided to take the only way out he saw fit, through murder. With this revelation, Olivia knew she had all the evidence she needed. Jason's motive was clear. His obsession had festered for years, leading to this final, violent act. But there was still one final question. How could he have executed the murder so coldly? What had triggered his decision that night? Olivia's instincts told her that Jason wasn't finished yet, that his obsession would only deepen. She needed to act fast before he could do more damage. The investigation was reaching its final stages, but the most crucial part was yet to come. The morning light filtered through Detective Olivia Harris's office window, casting long shadows across the cluttered desk. It was a fresh day, but there was no sense of relief. The case had come too close, and the looming confrontation with Jason Edwards had Olivia on edge. Despite having uncovered the chilling truth behind Sarah's murder, she still felt a sense of urgency, as if something was left undone, something Jason had yet to reveal. Jason was in custody, but Olivia knew he wasn't the type of person to just accept the consequences of his actions. He had a calculated mind, and everything he had done, from his obsessive behavior to the staged nature of the crime, indicated that he believed he could somehow talk his way out of it. Olivia needed to get him to confess fully, to understand his motives in his own words, and to break him down. But she knew it wouldn't be easy. Jason had a way of twisting things, manipulating the narrative to serve his version of events. At precisely 10 a.m., Olivia entered the interrogation room. Jason was seated at the table, his posture rigid and confident, as though he were still in control. He looked more put together than he had during his initial questioning. His suit neatly pressed, his hands folded in front of him, his expression calm and unreadable. It was the face of a man who had prepared for this moment, ready to face the consequences with the air of someone who thought they could still escape the truth. "Jason," Olivia began, her voice steady but stern, "we've been over this already, but today we're going to dig a little deeper. I need to understand why you killed Sarah." Jason leaned back in his chair, a small smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. "Detective, I already told you. I loved her. She was mine, and she betrayed me. What else is there to understand?" Olivia crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "You loved her? Is that what you tell yourself, Jason? Because it looks to me like you couldn't stand the idea of her being happy without you. She moved on, and you couldn't let go of the control you once had. That's not love, that's obsession, that's jealousy, and it led to murder." Jason's expression faltered for just a moment, but it was enough for Olivia to notice. His eyes flickered with a flash of something, guilt perhaps, but it was gone before he could mask it. He quickly recovered his composure, folding his arms and leaning forward. "You don't understand. She was everything to me. I thought we were going to get married. I thought she was the one who would complete me. But then she left me for someone else. She moved on, just like that," he said, his voice growing colder with each word. "And I couldn't just let that happen. She couldn't just throw me away and pretend like I never existed." Olivia felt a chill run through her. It was the same obsessive, possessive language that Amber had mentioned. The words, the justification. It was as though Jason had convinced himself that Sarah owed him her life. To him, she was still his, and no one else could have her. Not even Matt. Not even the love of her life. "You killed her because she didn't belong to you anymore," Olivia said, leaning in, her tone a sharp contrast to his. "But it's more than that, isn't it, Jason? You couldn't stand the idea of her being happy with someone else. She wasn't yours to control anymore, so you took matters into your own hands." Jason's eyes hardened. "She was always mine. I told her that time and time again. She could never escape me." Olivia leaned back in her chair, letting his words sink in. This wasn't just a crime of passion. It was a deliberate, cold act of control. Jason had been manipulating Sarah, keeping her in a state of emotional dependence. And when she tried to break free, he had decided to destroy her. "You went to Sarah's house that night," Olivia said, her voice steady. "You had a plan. You waited for her to be vulnerable after her wedding, and you knew she would be there, alone. You saw it as your last chance to reclaim what you thought was yours, and you took it." Jason's eyes twitched, the smallest sign of frustration. "You don't understand. She was the one who hurt me. She lied to me, and when I found out she was with someone else, I just snapped. I had to stop her before she did it again." Olivia remained calm, refusing to let his words sway her. She knew now that Jason had spent months, maybe even years, holding on to his delusional belief that Sarah owed him something. His desire to control her had been festering, building into something lethal. But there was still one thing she needed to confirm: the motive behind the specific moment of the murder. "Tell me about the gun," Olivia pressed. "You used your own weapon, didn't you? You didn't even try to hide it. You made sure we would find it, but you knew we would. You knew we would connect the dots. It was a part of your plan all along, wasn't it?" Jason stiffened, his eyes darting briefly to the table before returning to hers. He shifted in his seat. "I wasn't thinking straight. I didn't mean for it to go that far. But she just kept pushing me away. I thought we could talk, but she didn't want to listen. She was stubborn. She refused to understand." "Understand what?" Olivia asked. "That you wanted her back? That you couldn't bear the idea of her living her own life, free from you?" Jason's face twisted with anger, his fist clenched on the table. "You don't get it. She couldn't just throw me away. She wasn't supposed to leave me. I was going to make her see, make her remember what we had. But she didn't want to remember, so I made her." The final pieces of the puzzle were now in place. Jason had not only murdered Sarah out of jealousy, but he had also done it with the intent to punish her for leaving him. He had believed that his obsession with her would bring her back to him, and when it didn't, he decided that ending her life was the only way to regain the control he thought he had lost. Olivia took a deep breath, leaning in one final time. "Jason, you knew exactly what you were doing. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was premeditated. You planned it, you executed it, and now you'll face the consequences." Jason stared at her, his eyes wild with a mixture of rage and realization. "You can't—" His words caught in his throat as he realized he had no way out. "Yes, I can," Olivia replied coldly. "And you will. For Sarah, for Matt, for everyone you've hurt." The final confession had been made. Jason Edwards was no longer a man in control. He was a murderer, and Olivia Harris had brought him to justice. The case was closed. But for Olivia, it was just another reminder of the lengths to which some people would go when consumed by obsession and jealousy. As she left the interrogation room, she couldn't help but think of Sarah, of the life that had been taken far too soon. But justice had been served, and that was all Olivia could offer.